Welcome, everyone, to our afternoon session of the Canada-United States Law Institute. At this time, I'd like to recognize certain individuals with respect to this conference. And first of all, I want to recognize the Executive Committee, which really functions as the Board of Directors of the Canada-United States Law Institute, it's an institute between Case Western Reserve University School of Law and the University of Western Ontario's Faculty of Law. So I'm going to read out the names of our Executive Committee. If you could stand when I read your names. Dick Cunningham, Larry Herman, Jim Blanchard, James Graham, Raul Rosado, Jim Peterson, Selma Lusenberg. I just saw Selma. She's not here right now. Rick Newcomb. Yeah, Rick. Diane Francis, who unfortunately can't be here. Chris Sands, who cannot be here. Peter McKay. Okay. Kai Carmody. There's Kai. Michael Scharf, who's the Dean of the Case Law School, and Erica Chamberlain. They're not here right now. She's the Dean of the University of Western Ontario's Law Faculty. I also want to give special thanks to those who worked hard to make sure that this conference was put on and run smoothly. Eileen Drabowski in the back over there. Brian Glaviano. Yeah. Brian Glaviano, if you see him, he's the one with the camera. And of course, my partner in all of this, Ted Perrin. Ted. Finally, I also, before we start the program, want to give special thanks to our sponsors who financially support this institute. Without them, we can't do the things that we do. And so I want to give special thanks to our platinum sponsor, one of our deep supporters over the years, DLA Piper, which Rick Newcomb and Jim Blanchard are a part of. Our gold sponsor this year is the Government of Canada through its consular office in Detroit, and we're here with Joe Comartin. So, Joe, thank you very much. Silver sponsors are the law firm of Steptoe and Johnson, Herman and Associates, Cleveland Cliffs, James Graham here, and the law firm of Baker and Hostetler. And finally, our bronze sponsors, Taft, Stettinius, and Hollister, Bruce Lowe. Formica Corporation, Raul, where are you? Thank you very much. And Baird in America. So let's thank our sponsors. At this time, unfortunately, Senator Sherrod Brown wanted to be here, but he couldn't be here. But he wanted us to present his greetings. So at this time, we have a short presentation from Senator Sherrod Brown.
I'm Sherrod Brown. It's a privilege to serve as Ohio's United States Senator. Thank you to Jim Peterson, to Jim Blanchard, a longtime friend, and everyone with the Canada-United States Law Institute at CASE for your work on this 43rd annual conference. CASE is one of our city's great institutions. Conferences like this bring scholars and leaders and policymakers from around the country and around the world to our great city. The topic you're tackling at this year's conference is so important. Climate change, as we all know, is one of the defining moral issues of our time. We have to take aggressive action now. It means accelerating our transition to carbon-free power. It means investing in technologies to make our manufacturers more energy efficient. It means creating jobs in clean energy everywhere. I've always refused to accept the idea that we have to choose between good environmental policy and good paying jobs. We put Americans to work. We change course before it's too late. Climate change is not a future problem. It's doing real damage in this country right now. It's past time to rejoin the Paris Agreement, to restart the Clean Power Plan, to implement aggressive fuel economy standards for cars and trucks. And it's not just a problem on the coast. It's threatening thousands of workers in Ohio who rely on Lake Erie for their livelihood. Tourism, boat captains, other industries that rely on clean water. That's why your work is so important. While the President and far too many members of Congress deny the problem, They play political games. They spread lies. Leaders like you in both countries are working to confront this threat. Thank you so much.
And now it's time for our Luncheon Keynote presentation, which is going to take another and different look at the impact of climate change, that from the perspective of national security and national defense. And to introduce our afternoon keynote luncheon speaker is our own executive committee member, former Secretary of Defense for Canada, former Attorney General for Canada, Peter MacKay.
Thank you very much, Stephen. I want to thank the Institute and everyone for being here for this important discussion. I have the real pleasure, the honor to introduce John MacKay, or MacKay, depending on how you like to pronounce it. John, I used to get his mail often, as he got mine when we served in Parliament. He has been a lawyer and a lawmaker for over 21 years in the Parliament of Canada, elected 6 times, perhaps soon to be 7. And John has served and been a chairman of numerous parliamentary committees. But more than that, what I know of John is that he is tremendously committed to public policy making, to his community of Scarborough and Guildwood, Ontario. He has been an active parliamentarian, somebody who very much took part in some of the difficult and contentious debates that should happen in our legislatures. And he's been a leading voice on very important issues around public policy. He's also, in my estimation, underestimated in terms of the contributions that he made through private members' bills, which I can tell you are very rare birds. It's difficult for an opposition party member, let alone even a member of the government who doesn't sit in the cabinet, to bring about legislation in the Parliament of Canada. John has done something that I don't think any other parliamentarian has accomplished in over 150 years. He was able to move 2 legislation, 2 bills, one while in opposition and another while a member of the government. One involving an important public policy matter that was little known, and that was flammable cigarettes. And there are hundreds of people who have died as a result of cigarettes that would ignite. And John brought in legislation to curtail that. He also worked in many compassionate areas, areas around social responsibility that Larry and others have referred to. Social responsibility that brought about greater corporate action and accountability. And most recently, he has been working on a bill that touches very near and dear to my heart. My wife is a human rights activist, and it has to do with modern slavery. One of the real scourges that undermines our society. The modern slavery that goes on in our countries, but around the world, is truly an area that requires much greater attention, much greater legislation, and much greater focus. And while John and I were on opposite sides of the aisle, we crossed paths many times throughout our political career and even crossed swords on occasion in Parliament and in committee. What there can never be any doubt is John MacKay's commitment and perseverance for the betterment of his community, his country, and the world. He's traveled extensively on parliamentary committees to places like Africa and impoverished regions with a mind to trying to help and to move in a positive direction. And so I'm very pleased, and we should all be very thankful to have John MacKay here to present on important issues around national security and defense that are very much impacted by the effects of climate change. And we will need people like John to continue to lead this effort in government. So ladies and gentlemen, please welcome John MacKay.
Thanks, Peter. Those are the nicest words you've said about me in years. Peter's and my appreciation for each other sort of dipped when he was the Minister of Defense and I was the Liberal Party's critic for defense. But we've since regained ground, I have to say. Peter, I was heartily pleased when you retired in 2015 because now I, too, don't have to send your mail back to you. And I am so sick of saying I am not Peter MacKay. I'm not asked that anymore, so thank you. And it's good to see that everybody's got life after politics. I see my friend Joe over here. It's just delightful to see him. Joe is one of the most thoughtful guys that the House of Commons has ever had in the history of the House of Commons. And I saw John Godfrey here. Oh, there he is. He's still here. John was our intellectual bread bank, and whenever you wanted to find out about climate change, you talked to John. And Martha, I saw Martha here as well. Ah, there's Martha, and my good friend Jim. So all of whom seem to be doing extraordinarily well. And for those of us who are facing an election and maybe having that issue face us, it's encouragement and comfort to see all of you here. Now, it is a little intimidating to speak after experts. I will not make any profession that I am in any way, shape, or form an expert on climate change. And I did want to, and this is the commercial announcement, from the Government of Canada, having just tabled a budget. You know how people say, I'm really pleased to be here, thank you for the invitation. They always say that at the beginning. You have no idea how pleased I am to be here. We just came through a 36-hour voting marathon, and I had to say to my whip, I have to be in Cleveland on Friday. So that means I have to get out from this voting marathon. And because you are such a prestigious organization, he felt he had to release me. But the National Defense in the 2020 budget is committing $225 million to infrastructure projects, which is something I want to talk about over the next few minutes, to reduce the department's carbon footprint and greenhouse gas emissions by 40%. From 2005 levels by 2030. But before I talk about why I'm here, I wanted to talk about the Permanent Joint Board of Defense. And I'm told that there is a clicker here. That's fine. Oh, that's your clicker. This is my clicker. Okay. So. No, that's the pointer thing. Apparently I have a clicker. Clicker doesn't work. Does anybody...
It's the big green button.
I'm pressing the big green button. Ah, there we are. All right. So the Permanent Joint Board of Defense, of which I have the honor to co-chair, was formed in 1940 by Prime Minister Mackenzie King and President Roosevelt. And you'll see that the third person in that picture, barely recognizable person in that picture, is of course Winston Churchill, looking at the conversation between the two best friends, Mackenzie King and President Roosevelt, both of whom were Harvard men, both of whom vacationed together, both of whom had a really strong relationship with each other. Not quite comparable to the current relationship, may I say, between them. And Mackenzie King had the realization that regardless of the outcome of World War II, Canada's security interests would necessarily be transitioning from being part of the British Empire to being part of the continental defense of North America. Both came from political aristocracy. Those, it goes without saying that President Roosevelt was political aristocracy. Mackenzie King was the grandson of William Lyon Mackenzie King, who in 1837 led a rebellion against the British and briefly declared Canada as a republic. For his troubles, he had to leave Canada until the British calmed down for his uppityness. Nevertheless, Mackenzie King felt that as Canada transitioned, we would have to have a joint way of managing the defense of North America. Winston Churchill, as you can see, was none too happy with the prospect. President Roosevelt was at that time very concerned about the undefended coast, west coast of Canada. So if you imagine from the Alaska Panhandle down to the US border was a largely undefended space, and he felt that something had to be done about that. And so in some respects, this was the genesis for the Permanent Joint Board of Defense, which meets on an annual and sometimes more frequent basis than every year and has met since 1940. To give the importance that it deserved to this consultative body, the direct lines of report were from the Canadian co-chair directly to the Prime Minister, not through the Minister of Defense, not through anybody else, but directly to the Prime Minister, and the American co-chair directly to the President of the United States. My current co-chair is General Chris Miller. And it is the senior advisory body on continental defense that you've never heard of. All modern militaries include climate change in their planning. So after we go through the various international issues facing both of our militaries, and after we go through our hemispheric discussions, also all facing our militaries, the reason that this body is so effective is that at the end, it draws up a to-do list, an accountable to-do list. It's all terribly military, but it probably accounts for 80 years of success. One of the most significant changes, and of course there are literally more changes than you can imagine, facing Canada and the United States in military planning is planning in the Arctic. And I think this is a map that possibly we don't look at enough. Canada has had the great security fortune of having the Atlantic Ocean on one side, the Pacific Ocean on the other, and this great mass of ice to the north. And it has served us well as a, if you will, security blanket. However, with climate change and advances in technology, there has been major developments in the Arctic. And as you know the climate change in the north is particularly exaggerated. If you will, the north puts the change in climate change because there is so much happening by virtue of the melting that's going on with the polar ice cap. And what were literally frozen border conflicts are no longer frozen. So, just to name three, Hans Island, which you can barely find on the line between Canada and Denmark, sort of around Alert there, is a 1 kilometer square island, literally in the middle of nowhere, to which both Canada and Denmark claim jurisdiction. It is not likely that we are going to be going to war with Denmark over that island. Nevertheless, it does give you a notion of why these things are difficult. The Alaska-Canada border. Now, Canada wants to draw a straight line, straight up, straight north. The United States wants to draw another line which is equidistant from either shore, and I wish I would look for a map that I could get a better explanation. But the conflict in the Arctic, potential conflict in the Arctic, is 21,000 square kilometers. That's a lot of conflict. A lot of resources are in those 21,000 square kilometers, and it will be a test between our two nations as to how we handle that conflict. You'll see the Northwest Passage there. Now, Canada claims that as an inland waterway. And if it's an inland waterway, we have environmental jurisdiction, we have fisheries jurisdiction, we have control over the passage, and various other issues. The United States, and pretty well everyone else, regards it as an international waterway. Now, we could probably make some accommodations with our American colleagues transiting that waterway. I'm not quite so sure that we can make so many accommodations with Chinese or Russian ships transiting that waterway. So this may well be a security flashpoint coming forward. Now, to meet these ongoing security challenges, we are having to change our infrastructure programs and the elements in the military that we need to secure in order to project our sovereignty. Okay, this is like a regular, there we are. That's what we're buying. Okay, well, that's not quite what we're buying. That's actually what we're buying. And Peter will, of course, be familiar with the Arctic offshore patrol vessels, which can navigate in light sea ice. And there's 6 underway in Peter's hometown right now of Halifax. I've been to the Irving shipyards. It's quite a dramatic facility and quite an amazing way in which they put these ships together. The first one is out the door and in the water and being retrofitted, and I'm told that in June it will be turned over to the Royal Canadian Navy. And there's 4, possibly 5 more to follow. So that is one of the ways in which the Canadian military has responded to climate change. But of course, building in the Arctic has unique challenges because, as I said, the Arctic puts the change into climate change. So you can imagine building a building in the Arctic. And bear in mind, Canadian military works on a 40-year timeline. So they have to project forward 40 years as to the stability of the landmass. What is going to be happening with this landmass? So if you're putting up a fuel depot, you want to make sure that it's on a stable footing. If you're putting up a runway, you want to make sure that it's on a stable footing. If you're siting a wharf, you want to make sure that it is not going to be inundated by unanticipated water, and you're also wanting to be sure that it's not stranded. So these are the difficulties that are facing the Canadian military and challenges which some are really, really quite extraordinary. In addition to the Arctic offshore icebreakers, we need to, Arctic offshore patrol vessels, we need to up our game with icebreakers. This is, I believe, our only icebreaker still in operation. We need at least 3 more. The procurement contract has not been let. The Russians, in contrast, have 11. Now, you've heard about the Russian militarization of the Arctic. And I'm grateful to Senator Sullivan for this graphic because it shows it in a way that few of us actually can appreciate. We live, not only do we live south of 70, we live south of 60. And some of us, even here, we're below 49. So we don't actually necessarily appreciate that the Russians are really citing a number of bases and planes and missiles. The missile challenge is becoming more and more difficult because of the aggressive way in which the Russians are developing their missiles. You can now start your missile further back below the horizon, have it run faster and lower, and be upon your, target much more quickly than you have in the past. It used to be you had to send your missile up and then have it come down. Now you don't have to send it nearly as far up, and you're sending it a lot faster. That, in turn, puts your defenses on the other side in some difficulty because you have to be able to react to those missiles coming in. Now, I'm not talking about imminent threat, shall we say, but the military has to, the Canada, US military, have to plan for the worst. You know, plan for the worst and hope for the best. And as you can see, there's a cluster of bases right at the Bering Strait there between Alaska and the USSR. And then there's another cluster just off Norway and Sweden. And a lot of these are new. And it does bring, and it is entirely due to the fact that what was previously frozen is now a reality and can be navigated. And with the advances in technology, the borders, if you will, just became a lot closer. These are, if you will, public source, open source documents of Canada's presence in the military. Peter will be relieved that I'm not going to talk about the jets. That's a Canadian joke, by the way. we have one of the biggest challenges is replacing the early warning system. It is extremely complex to have an all-domain warning system. And as I say, you can imagine from the previous slide just exactly where those missiles and airplanes may be coming. These are not idle conversations. The Russian military has, for whatever purposes best known to it, increased their incursions into North American airspace. We are having to scramble our jets much more frequently. We are having to react to these incursions each and every time, and it makes for a very active North. The early warning system you see there has to be replaced. And to replace that, you have to take into consideration the issue of climate change. Before, you could count on that ground being frozen. How can you now site a station where the ground may not stay frozen? Example, the dew line, which was the predecessor to this early warning system, was dismantled, and in large measure, what couldn't be taken away was buried. It was thought to be buried and frozen. Now it's no longer buried nor frozen, and we have a significant environmental issue in the northern reaches of Canada to deal with. So these are just part of the issues that are facing the Canadian military. I have a real privilege of chairing this organization, co-chairing this organization. And I would say to this room, and I'm sure Peter would agree with me, you can take great comfort in the relationship on a personal level and on a military-to-military level between our two countries. Ignore the rhetoric. Please ignore the rhetoric. Because the level of cooperation and dialogue is actually quite significant. And because it's quite significant, our levels of security are well handled by the men and women, both in uniform and out of uniform, who represent us. PJBD has recently grown to include diplomatic representatives and also people from Homeland Security and from public safety. And the reason for that is that security and military are fast moving together. I'll give you a little illustration. My committee had before it Professor Clement from the University of Toronto last week. The subject that we are studying as a committee is the way in which financial services in particular, but business in general, are vulnerable to cybersecurity intrusions. Professor Clement put up before us a slide of the cables that join Asia and North America, Europe and North America. And his point was simple. If you want to disrupt the cable traffic, the very infrastructure on which we depend, just attach a something or other to one of those cables. It is profoundly simple to do. I related that immediately to an experience I had this summer. This summer, I had the good fortune to travel on one of our frigates from Iqaluit down through Frobisher Bay and over to Greenland, Nuuk, Greenland. And there we were met by the Danish general who was in charge of the NATO for that particular reason. And he talked about the various security risks, and I won't go into all of them, but one that really stuck in my mind was the fact that Russian ships seem to have an immense fascination of doing scientific research right over top of the cables that join North America and Europe. I don't know whether you conclude anything from that, or I don't conclude anything from that. But here, at one level, the Danish general is giving us his analysis of security risks that affect that particular part of the world. And a few months later, there's a University of Toronto professor telling us about how simple it would be to affect security and impede our infrastructure. And if we think that this is just an academic issue, take out your cell phone and ask yourself, if I'm sending an email to somebody, where is that message going? Where does it go? Well, I don't know where it goes from Cleveland. But when you're in Toronto, it sometimes goes off to Chicago, bounces over to Boston, and back into Toronto. Sometimes it goes up to Montreal, goes down to North Carolina, and then comes into Toronto. We are quite vulnerable. Now that is not a climate change risk, but it does illustrate the way in which those who would do us harm can easily do us harm and disrupt just normal, ordinary lives. So, as I say, military issues and security issues are, I think, becoming much more fused, and that is not only a result of changes in climate, but it's also a change in technologies that are moving at a pace that some of us are having troubles keeping up with. Of course, nobody in the room has that same experience. So, with that, I'm going to conclude, but I would reiterate once again, you folks in the United States are well served by your people in the military. The people I've met in the military in the United States are first rate. And I would say that as well with our Canadian people. They are first rate and are making the adjustments and responses as best they can. But as you well know, climate change is moving with a tremendous pace, and technology is also moving with a tremendous pace, and the intersection of those two make it extraordinarily difficult to keep up with all of the security challenges that each of them have. So thank you.
We have a chance for some questions.
You may have a chance for questions. I don't know if I'll have any answers. So, okay.
I noticed that you said that there was 1 Canadian icebreaker, 11 Russian.
Yeah.
How many U.S. icebreakers are on there? And by the way, I just love the way those maps look. It's an angle we rarely see.
I think it's an angle you're going to be seeing a lot more of. And the short answer is I don't know. I was on a U.S. Coast Guard exercise in Miami. Oh, man, they just ordered 56 of these things. Former Minister of Defense would drool to have those ships. So the short answer is I don't know, but whatever it is, there's not enough. Oh, sorry, there.
Thank you for your comments about some real security challenges that the U.S. and Canada are facing linked to climate change. You mentioned the need for more icebreakers. What other sorts of solutions do you want to see to try to address the problem and deal with the problem Is it an issue of focus more on climate mitigation and reducing emissions and things like that? Are there certain adaptation measures? Sort of, what's your fix for it?
All of the above.
Okay.
But I think one of the immediate needs is mapping. We actually don't know much about what's in the under the Arctic Ocean, and that makes transit extremely hazardous. And there have been some recent examples where ships have run aground. And as you can see, even if your ship is based in Iqaluit or Nuuk, Greenland or whatever, and you have an incident somewhere along the Northwest Passage, it's a long time to get there. The trip I was on this summer, in addition to a few of us who are parliamentarians, and some business people actually, were some Canadian Army people along with rangers. We have 1,800 rangers, as you see, and these are local Indigenous people, specially commissioned by the military to provide a watching of what's going on. There was the training exercise had to be canceled. This is in August. It had to be canceled because of conditions in which our ships could not sail. So that's a significant adjustment for getting to something that may well be an emergency. You just simply can't get there. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Yeah, John, Mark Fisher with the Council of the Great Lakes Region. Thanks for the presentation. I guess the question I have for you is, the U.S. military strategically over the years has done a number of different public-facing reports about the climate change as a threat, globally, but also to continental United States. I haven't seen the Canadian Armed Forces, at least in a public way, speak to it as in an open as way as I think the U.S. military has. Is there some consideration happening about being more, clear and open about that particular risk and threat to the Canadian geography? First question. Then the second question is from a permanent joint board of defense perspective, has there been any discussion about doing a strategic assessment in terms of the impacts of climate change for continental defense, right? And really understanding what the trends look like and how do we collectively respond. This morning we heard, I think it might have been, I can't remember who it was, who indicated that with sea level rise, U.S. Navy alone is going to be in a serious position in terms of ports and infrastructure and what have you. So has there been any discussion about doing a continental assessment about climate change and how do we collectively prepare and respond to that risk?
Let me say that the Canadian military has not been as vocal as I think it should have been. They did release the policy paper, Strong, Secure, and Engaged. There was quite a extensive discussion about the impacts of climate change on military preparedness. On the PJBD, it drives us crazy. It's difficult to imagine what this is going to be. With respect to the replacement to the early warning system, we're not even sure we can land sight it anymore. If you're going to be an all domain, that means you're going to be under the water, you're going to be on the water, you're going to be on the land, you're going to be in the air, you're going to be up in the space, and you might as well layer in cyberspace. That's pretty significant. And a major challenge. In addition, NORAD wants to site one of its main bases somewhere further north. There's 6 sites under consideration, 3 of which are in Canada. The Americans in particular want to refurbish Toole up in the north end of Greenland. And that may be an option. It's not our, by that I mean Canadians' preferred option. But that's one of the things that's on the table. There's, okay, 2 mic, 1 there and 1 there. Sorry.
first.
You always have to give the former ambassador.
Right here.
I just wanted to remark, I'm not sure how that's changed since the Soviet Union went out of business, but in the olden days, all of the Soviet Navy's capital ships had icebreaker prows. So if you can, their ability to field icebreaking capable ships is probably seriously greater than 11.
Excellent point. And I don't know whether our people have considered it. I may well have. I just don't know.
I'm assuming that your counterparts in our country here, and I'm confident you're correct when you say the working relationship is outstanding and trusting and has been forever. Well, at least since 1940. But I'm assuming they kind of ignore the cozying up of my president, or I should say the President of the United States, to Mr. Putin, his love affair with Putin, his willingness to paraphrase Soviet propaganda. I'm assuming our military people kind of let that roll off and continue our vigilance and our cooperation. Is that correct?
I did put in the previous reiteration of the speech some comments about fake news and fake science and that it's all a conspiracy theory, but power is greater than mine with bigger paychecks persuaded me that I would create a diplomatic incident if I made any commentary along those lines as well. I think the core point, though, is very simple. Military to military cooperation, homeland security to public safety cooperation, minister to minister is really quite good. And certainly with Madison and Sagen, there was a really fine working relationship there. So I think people need to take some comfort in that. It does make for some awkward moments, and certainly over a beer or something a little bit stronger, there's some commentary that might even happen. But by and large, ignore that, get on with the business. So, and for the years I've been involved with it, and I'm sure, again, Peter could reiterate that, it's been a solid working relationship.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.